Imagine for a second that you finally acquire everything you ever wanted. You know, you secure the promotion, you find the ideal spouse, you have healthy children, and you buy the house with the perfect backyard.
Right, the absolute dream scenario for most people.
Yeah, but instead of waking up feeling liberated and joyful, you wake up feeling utterly trapped. You look at the calendar and you feel suffocated by the sheer weight of maintaining it all.
It happens all the time.
It really does. You start fantasizing about running away, leaving the office behind, escaping the relentless needs of the toddlers, and just finding an isolated beach somewhere. Well, welcome to Reform Thinking. Today, we are taking a deep dive into an ancient text that claims your natural desire to escape your responsibilities is the precise thing killing your joy.
Yes, and that is a massive claim to make.
It is. Because, you know, we live in an era of unprecedented information overload. You open your phone, and within 5 minutes, you consume more conflicting advice about how to find happiness than a person a few centuries ago encountered in a whole lifetime.
Oh, without a doubt.
Yet clear, actionable wisdom for your actual daily life. The kind of wisdom that helps you make sense of a stressful Monday morning commute or a chaotic dinner time feels incredibly rare.
It does feel rare, and that is why our source material today is so shocking to the modern ear. We are looking closely at Psalm 128, and we are analyzing it through the lens of Charles Spurgeon's classic, The Treasury of David, alongside historical commentaries from figures like John Calvin, Martin Luther, and several others.
And what we have in front of us completely upends our cultural assumptions, right?
Spot on. I mean, modern culture often treats our primary obligations, going to work, maintaining a marriage, raising children, as heavy burdens. They are framed as obstacles to our self-actualization.
Right, like they are getting in the way of the real you.
Yes, but this psalm positions those very obligations not as burdens, but as the actual mechanics of divine blessing.
Okay, well, let's unpack this baseline idea, because to understand where we are going, we have to understand the specific context of this text. Spurgeon notes right at the beginning that Psalm 128 is a song of degrees. What does that mean for the person reading it?
The songs of degrees, or the songs of ascents, were the specific psalms sung by the Hebrew pilgrims as they literally walked uphill to Jerusalem for the annual feasts.
So it was a physical journey.
Very physical. They left their farms, their businesses, and their regular routines, and they made a demanding climb up into the mountains. So the phrase implies an ascent, stepping up.
Got it.
And context is key here. Psalm 128 follows directly after Psalm 127. Now, Psalm 127 talks about the exhausting process of building a house, warning that unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain.
Right, so a lot of raw effort and construction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Precisely. Now, in Psalm 128, we move past the raw construction phase. The physical building is done. We are looking at a picture of that house already built, adorned, and functioning.
Oh, I see. You build the foundation, and then you step up into the enjoyment of what has been constructed.
Yes, you step into the finished house.
So, to understand the destination of this built and blessed house, we first have to look at the inner life of the individual living inside it. Verse 1 of the Psalm sets the baseline. It says that blessedness is connected to two distinct things: fearing the Lord and walking in his ways.
That is the core requirement.
But I have to stop right there and push back on that first condition. How do fear and blessedness, which we generally equate with happiness, coexist?
It is a great question.
I mean, if I think about human relationships, fear and happiness do not mix well at all. If I go to work every day terrified of a demanding boss, constantly walking on eggshells, wondering if I'm going to get fired over a typo, I am definitely not happy. I am miserable.
Well, nobody wants to live like that.
So what kind of fear are we talking about here? Is the text telling us to walk on eggshells around the Almighty?
Well, that is a very natural tension to highlight, and the commentators address it head on, because the word fear carries so much negative psychological baggage for us today. To clear this up, we can look at the brilliant analysis provided by Robert Nisbet.
Okay, what does he say?
He draws a sharp, necessary distinction between different types of fear. He points out that there is a terror that a warring rebel feels when facing a triumphant, offended sovereign.
Right, that makes sense.
Or there is the dread a fraudulent bankrupt feels toward a stern creditor who holds the force to throw them in prison, or a conscience-stricken criminal toward a righteous judge.
Yeah, that is the walking on eggshells fear I mentioned.
Spot on. It is driven by the anticipation of punishment and destruction. But Nisbet argues that this is absolutely not the fear the blessed person in this psalm feels.
So what is the alternative? If it is not the fear of punishment, What motivates it?
Nisbet calls it a filial fear.
Filial, so relating to a family dynamic.
Yes. Think of the reverence a loyal child feels toward an honored parent. Or, even more accurately, think of the awe of someone who has been rescued from total destruction by a benefactor.
Oh, someone who made a vast personal sacrifice to save them.
That is right. In that scenario, your fear is not about being crushed by them. Your fear is an intense, consuming anxiety about acting unworthily of that immense kindness.
Wow, so you dread offending the one who saved you out of sheer gratitude.
Yes, you are terrified of breaking the heart of the one who loves you.
That makes a lot of sense, and it totally shifts the paradigm. It changes the motivation from selfish self-preservation to outward-facing gratitude. I want to please the benefactor because of what they have done, not because I am dodging a lightning bolt.
It's an entirely different posture of the heart.
But still, fear is a heavy emotion. Does carrying around this massive reverence weigh a person down?
Actually, the commentators argue it does the exact opposite. Robert Leighton adds a fascinating insight to this psychological dynamic.
What does he add?
He notes that having this one massive reverential fear of God actually swallows up all other petty worldly fears. It functions as an ultimate antidote to daily anxiety.
Wait, how does one big fear cure 100 little anxieties? Walk me through the mechanics of that.
Well, Leighton says that if you are completely secure in your standing with the creator of the universe, you become largely undaunted by anything else society throws at you.
Because the biggest issue is already settled.
Precisely. Think about the hundreds of tiny, vexing fears that consume our mental energy on a daily basis. We fear losing our status. We fear the opinions of our peers. We fear financial downturns. We fear aging.
Yeah, that is basically the human condition right there.
But if your primary overarching concern is simply honoring the God who secured your future, those other fears lose their leverage over you.
Because if God is pleased with your faithful conduct, the shifting opinions of other people simply do not hold weight anymore.
That is it. If you face rejection at work or if friends become estranged, it loses its sting because your core relationship is unshakable. This central reverence displaces the chaotic noise of worldly panic.
So the internal heart is settled. But the text does not let us just sit there in a state of internal peace. Verse 1 immediately connects that internal emotion to an external action.
Right, walking in his ways.
Yes, that walketh in his ways. Here is where it gets highly interesting to me. The religion being described here is very practical. It is not just an emotional high you get from listening to a good choir or reading a moving piece of theology in your armchair.
No, it demands forward motion.
Spurgeon points out that it is idle to talk about having this reverence if you act like someone who simply does not care. If the heart is genuinely joined to God, the feet will automatically follow. The walk is the undeniable proof of the heart.
Yeah, the physical action validates the internal posture. And John Calvin observes something about this dynamic that speaks directly to how we view the world today.
What does Calvin say?
He points out that carnal reason, our natural, unspiritual way of assessing reality, tends to view human life as inherently miserable, or at best, dictated purely by random blind fortune.
We look around and we see righteous people suffering and wicked people prospering, and human reason concludes that the universe is just chaotic and unfair.
Which is how a lot of people feel when they read the news. It looks like chaos.
It really does.
But Calvin argues that true happiness is hidden under the guardianship of God. It is not always apparent to the physical eye, and it is certainly not measured by immediate material success.
So it requires a different metric.
Yes. To grasp this, you have to understand that true happiness is relational to the Creator, not circumstantial. The walk you mentioned, walking in His ways, is the practical mechanism for staying under that guardianship.
Meaning, the blessedness promised here is not a guarantee of a trouble-free life. It is a guarantee of divine companionship and approval on the path, regardless of the weather. So, if a person has this internal reverence sorted out, and they are committed to walking in this path, what happens when the alarm clock goes off on Monday morning?
Well, that brings us to verse 2.
Right, it shifts from a general statement to a highly personal application. The text says, "For thou shalt eat the labor of thine hands." The source material insists here that God is the God of laborers. It promises a recompense, a reward for honest industry.
He does.
But I need to challenge this because it feels like there is a contradiction here. If we operate under the theological baseline that God gives us all things freely by grace, why is there such an intense focus on the sweat of the brow? Or, as Spurgeon updates it, the the sweat of the brain.
That is a very common hang-up.
I mean, in Genesis, work, or at least the painful toil of work, is framed as part of the curse. The ground produces thorns and thistles. So how do these commentators justify calling this daily grind a divine blessing? Why doesn't the blessing look like a life of easy leisure on a beach?
That is a fantastic question because it touches on our most base assumptions about what a good life actually entails. We naturally equate blessing with the total removal of effort.
Right, we think the goal is passive income and zero responsibilities.
Yeah, Hugh McMillan addresses this directly, and he dismantles that modern fantasy. He says that human dreams of an earthly paradise, a place without sorrow or toil, where life is just one continuous, effortless festival, are actually rooted in pure selfishness.
Wait, so the desire to retire at 30 and sit by a pool is actually a moral failure in this view?
According to McMillan, yes, those are not holy desires. They are desires born out of sloth. He argues that in a fallen world, all true successes must be actively cultivated.
You mentioned the curse in Genesis earlier.
Yes, the ground does produce thorns, but the labor itself is the remedy, not just the punishment. McMillan uses the brilliant metaphor of slaying the dragons of selfishness and sloth to obtain any real reward.
Slaying the dragons, that is quite the image.
If we received everything we wanted without a single ounce of effort, we would not actually possess the capacity to enjoy it, nor would it build our character. The friction of the labor is what forms the virtues of patience, endurance, and gratitude.
So work is the designated arena for our human development.
Precisely.
I love that image. Slaying the dragons of selfishness and sloth. It makes the daily grind, whether you are writing code, framing a house, or doing the laundry, sound epic. It reframes the mundane.
It elevates the mundane to the realm of the sacred. And Martin Luther brings this down to earth with his characteristic bluntness.
What does Luther say?
He says that faith does not mean romantic idleness. It is not about sitting under a tree waiting for roasted pigeons to fly into your mouth.
That is a very Lutheric way of putting it.
It is. He says faith means getting a house, getting a spouse, and getting an ox to till the ground.
Let's talk about that ox for a second. Having an ox means you have to wake up early to feed it. You have to clean up after it. You have to guide it. It is a massive liability and a huge responsibility.
Yes, it is not a pet, it is work.
Right.
And Luther is saying that God uses our diligence in managing that ox or managing our modern equivalents like a team of employees, a budget, or a household as the specific channel by which he blesses us.
The labor itself is the conduit.
Yes. Spurgeon points out that whether you toil with your physical body or with your mind, there is no difference in the nature of the blessing. The promise is that the labor will be fruitful and that the person performing it will enjoy the recompense.
That is a massive comfort for anyone who feels like their daily tasks are invisible or meaningless.
It gives massive dignity to ordinary work.
And the text gets even more vivid about the result of that honest labor. It says, "Happy shalt thou be." One of the commentators points out that the Hebrew translation for this phrase is actually plural.
Yes. Oh, thy happinesses.
Right, it is a heaped up, overflowing joy. It is not just a single fleeting moment of satisfaction, but happiness arriving in 1,000 different ways.
That plural translation is very revealing. It suggests a multifaceted well-being that permeates every season of a person's life.
How does that play out over a lifetime, though?
Well, R.P. McMaster provides a brilliant contrast to illustrate this. He brings up a quote from the British statesman Benjamin Disraeli, who famously and cynically said that youth is a blunder, manhood a struggle, and old age a regret.
Oh, that is incredibly depressing.
It is.
But if we are honest, it feels accurate for a lot of people. You make mistakes when you were young, you fight to survive your middle years, and you look back wishing you had done it differently.
Yeah, McMaster agrees that Disraeli's assessment is an incredibly sad and cheerless view of life's progression. But he admits it is entirely accurate for a life separated from godliness.
So if you are living purely for yourself, that is the inevitable trajectory.
Right. However, McMaster argues that when life is allied with the kind of reverence we are talking about, this filial fear and diligent, honest labor, the entire progression completely reverses.
Oh, I like that. How does it reverse?
Well, youth is no longer a blunder. It becomes a season of wise purpose and setting a good baseline. Manhood is no longer just a struggle for survival. It becomes a conquest, a season of fruitful production.
And what about old age?
Old age is not a bitter regret. It becomes an abundant memory and a glorious prospect of the future.
So the challenge for the listener here is to view their current career or their daily chores not as a penalty to be endured, but as the designated arena for experiencing this heaped up plural goodness.
Exactly. And that is spot on.
So the progression we are tracking moves from the internal heart reverencing God to the external hands at work in the field or the office. And now the text moves indoors. We step into the architecture of the domestic ecosystem.
This is verse 3.
Right. Verse 3 says, "Thy wife shall be as a fruitful vine by the sides of thine house, thy children like olive plants round about thy table." Let's look at the specific geography of this vine metaphor. Why does the text specify by the sides of the house?
It is an interesting detail.
I read the commentary by Thomas Adams, and he has a fascinating take on this spatial arrangement. He says she is not on the roof, which would symbolize a ruler or a tyrant. She is not on the floor, which would symbolize a servant or a slave. She is on the sides, an equal, stabilizing place.
The spatial metaphors here carry a lot of weight. To fully grasp this, we have to look at the historical architecture of the time.
What did the houses look like?
Thomas Harmer explains that these ancient Middle Eastern houses were typically built around a central open courtyard, with the private rooms ranged around the sides.
Okay, so the sides were the living quarters.
Yes, the inner private apartments. So the wife being by the sides indicates her active, faithful management of the home's interior life. She is the central stabilizing figure in the domestic sphere.
And the vine metaphor itself.
The vine metaphor also carries specific practical weight in that climate. A vine represents fruitfulness, but it also represents a need for a strong support structure. It relies on the architecture of the house.
Right. And what does that vine actually do for the people living there?
Well, John Gadsby provides a wonderful visual for this from his travels. He describes seeing massive vines trained over the streets and courtyards in Constantinople.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, in a blistering hot climate, those vines provided essential shade, cool comfort, and sweet clusters of grapes hanging right overhead.
That sounds incredible.
It is. The godly spouse is described in this exact way, providing a sanctuary of shade from the harshness of the outside world, yielding the wine of consolation when the laborer returns exhausted, and offering clusters of comfort to the entire household.
I can visualize those vines stretching across the courtyard, creating a kind of green sanctuary underneath. It is a place of absolute rest.
A sanctuary from the labor.
And then as we look around the table in that shaded courtyard, we see the children described as olive plants. W.M. Thompson provides an observation from an actual olive grove that I think completely changes how we read this verse.
Yes, the detail about the shoots.
Right. He points out that the text does not say olive branches. It says olive plants, or shoots. He describes walking through a grove and seeing an aged, gnarled, venerable parent olive tree.
And what was around it?
Springing up from the exact same root system, right around the base of that old tree, are several young, thrifty shoots. They surround the parent tree, they literally seem to uphold and embrace it in its old age, and they are preparing to bear the fruit that the aging tree can no longer bear, or to take its place entirely if it falls.
It is a stunning biological picture of generational succession and mutual support. The children are not just decorations at the table, they are not just mouths to feed.
No, they have a purpose.
They are active contributors to the commonwealth of the family, drawing from the same moral root system as the parents. But Richard Cecil adds a sobering layer to this botanical metaphor that every parent needs to hear.
Okay, what does he point out?
He notes that man, by nature, is a wild olive tree.
A wild olive tree. What does a wild olive tree produce?
If you leave a wild olive tree to itself, without cultivation, it produces small, wild, bitter fruit that is largely useless.
Yikes. So leaving a child to just figure it out on their own yields bitter fruit.
Spot on. So the goal of parenting, in this framework, is not to take a wild tree and just hang temporary accomplishments on it, like tying artificial fruit to a dead branch.
Right. You cannot just tape good grades and soccer trophies to a wild branch and call it a cultivated tree.
That is precisely it. You cannot just teach a child good manners or send them to a good school and expect genuine spiritual fruitfulness.
So what does it take?
The goal is the painstaking cultivation of sturdy shoots. It requires deliberate, daily effort to train those plants, to prune them, and to ensure they are drawing from the right root system. The table is not just a feeding station, it is a training ground.
The objective is to raise shoots that actively contribute to the peace, stability, and legacy of the home.
Yes, that is the entire point of the table.
Well, I have to admit, I am stuck on the transition that happens next.
Us.
We have built this beautiful, intimate, quiet dining room scene. The doors are shut. The family is eating the fruit of their labor under the shade of the vine. It feels incredibly safe. But then the lens zooms out massively.
Let's take a sharp turn.
Verse 4 issues what Spurgeon calls a nota bene, a command to mark this well. It says that this family blessedness comes explicitly from the Lord. It does not come from your wealth, it does not come from your healthy genetics, and it does not come from a perfectly executed chore chart.
Acknowledging the source.
And then verse 5 says, "The Lord shall bless thee out of Zion, and thou shalt see the good of Jerusalem." It feels like someone just turned on the bright stadium lights in a quiet movie theater.
It is a dramatic shift in focus.
Why does a psalm that has been entirely about private family life suddenly bring in Jerusalem and Zion? What does a person's private dinner table have to do with the national church or the public welfare of the city?
It feels jarring to our modern sensibilities because we highly compartmentalize our lives. We have our private family life in one box, our work life in another box, and our civic or religious life in yet another box entirely.
And we prefer to keep the boxes closed.
We do. But the Hebrew worldview did not operate that way. John Calvin provides the necessary synthesis here, and he uses a biological analogy to explain it.
Okay, what is the analogy?
He argues that it is fundamentally unreasonable for a single member of a body to desire what is profitable for itself while the whole body is neglected.
Meaning, a healthy hand cannot survive for long if the heart stops beating.
Precisely. If Jerusalem falls, your private courtyard falls with it. Calvin insists that solicitous care for the public welfare of the church and the broader community is demanded of the individual.
So your private blessing is inextricably linked to the public good.
It is.
So you were saying the bunker mentality, the idea that I can just barricade myself in my house, enjoy my fruitful vine, protect my olive shoots, and ignore the city burning outside, is actually self-destructive.
It is entirely self-destructive. The blessing is designed by God to radiate outward, not to be hoarded inward.
How does that radiation work?
We can look back to the priestly benediction in Numbers chapter 6 to understand the physical mechanics of this. Think about the layout of the wilderness encampment.
Okay, the tents in the desert.
Yes. The individual tents of the families were pitched all around the central tabernacle in a massive square. When the priests pronounced the blessing from the center, from the presence of God, that blessing radiated outward through the camp to each individual tent.
Oh, wow. I never pictured it that way.
The same logic applies here in Psalm 128. The Lord blesses out of Zion, which is the center of worship and truth, and that blessing washes over the individual household.
So because the individual family receives their peace from that center, they are naturally invested in the health and purity of that center.
Spot on. It is a reciprocal relationship.
It is a progression from tent mercies to temple mercies to national mercies. Spurgeon describes this beautifully as having a patriot's joy combined with a patriarch's peace.
That is a great way to phrase it.
It challenges you to look at your private household habits and ask very hard questions. Are the things happening at my dinner table strengthening or weakening my wider community? The way I raise these olive shoots, is it contributing to the good of Jerusalem, or is it just creating more chaos for the city to handle down the road?
That is the exact metric.
Yeah.
The very metric the text demands we use to evaluate our parenting and our daily lives.
And because the individual is connected to this eternal city, to Zion, the timeline of their impact extends far beyond their own brief lifespan. That brings us to the final verses.
Yes, where we see the ultimate legacy of this blessedness.
The psalm concludes in verse 6 with the promise, "Yea, thou shalt see thy children's children, and peace upon Israel." It points to long life, continued piety in the offspring, and rest for the heritage of God.
A multi-generational view.
Seeing grandchildren is described by several commentators as living your young life over again. It is the validation that the root system held firm, that the shoots took hold and are now producing their own fruit.
It is the proof of the cultivation.
But I have a serious question about that final phrase, peace upon Israel. Does this mean that the godly family, the one that fears the Lord, works hard, raises their children well, and cares for the city, will never face external attacks?
That is a fair thing to wonder.
Does peace mean the total absence of hard times or tragedy?
That is a very common and very dangerous misconception. Alexander Henderson provides a highly realistic commentary to correct it.
What does Henderson say?
He states clearly that peace does not consist in having no enemies or never being assaulted. He points out that there is an endless enmity against the people of God in this world.
So the arrows are still flying.
Yes, you cannot read the historical texts or look at the lives of the prophets or read the New Testament and conclude that obedience guarantees an easy, conflict-free existence. In fact, it often guarantees the opposite.
Right, so what kind of peace are we talking about if the arrows are still flying over the wall?
The peace mentioned here is a spiritual rest amidst the warfare. It is an internal fortification. Henderson uses the historical example of the patriarch Jacob to illustrate this perfectly.
Okay, let's look at Jacob.
Look at his life. It was characterized by intense, almost constant conflict. He fled for his life from his brother Esau. He was sorely tossed about and cheated by his father-in-law Laban. He faced severe famine, he wrestled physically with God, and he faced the immense tribulation of thinking his son Joseph was dead.
Where is the peace in that story? It sounds like a life of constant anxiety.
From the outside, yes. But eventually, Jacob found rest in Goshen. His soul found a steady, unshakable peace because he became a prevailing prince with God. He knew who held his future.
So it is an internal reality.
Yes, the peace upon Israel is not a lack of external pressure. It is an internal structural integrity that holds steady when the external pressure is applied. It is knowing that the house is built on the rock, so when the storm hits, the house does not fall.
So if we tie this whole progression together, we can see the brilliant, unbroken logic of the psalm. It starts in verse 1 with the internal fear of God, that filial, reverential awe.
That is the starting point.
That internal state leads directly to verse 2, which is faithful, diligent, honest work with your hands or your mind. That sustained, blessed labor provides for verse 3, the flourishing domestic ecosystem of the protective vine and the sturdy olive shoots.
The chain keeps moving outward.
Right. That healthy family unit then contributes to verse 5, the building up of the church and the welfare of the city. And all of that combined ensures, verse 6, a multi-generational legacy of spiritual resilience and internal peace amidst a hostile world.
It is a complete, connected chain.
If you remove one link, the whole thing falls apart.
It truly is a masterclass in how macro-level societal peace is constructed from micro-level faithfulness. You simply cannot have the peace upon Israel at the end of the psalm without the individual walking in the fear of the Lord at the beginning of the psalm.
Because the massive historical outcomes that shape nations are built entirely on the seemingly invisible daily habits of ordinary people working their jobs and eating with their families.
Spot on. It all starts at that granular level.
Let's bring this all the way down to the ground for the listener as we wrap up today. We started with the tension that modern life feels overwhelming, and our daily obligations often feel like heavy, suffocating burdens we want to escape.
That was the initial hook.
But through the analytical lens of Spurgeon, Calvin, Luther, and the others, we have seen a total reframing of reality. We trace the progression from the internal reverence for God, outward to the sweat of our daily labor, inward again to the intimate, shaded spaces of marriage and child-rearing, and then outward once more to the welfare of the city and the legacy of future generations.
It is a massive shift in perspective.
Here's the final thought I want to leave you to mull over. Consider that your daily, seemingly mundane tasks, getting up and driving to the office, cooking dinner for your family, sitting around the table, trying to instill a little bit of wisdom into your kids, and showing up for public worship are not distractions from your spiritual life.
No, they are not.
They are not chores keeping you from finding your true self. They are the exact raw materials God uses to construct multi-generational national peace. This perspective reframes the most ordinary, exhausting Tuesday into a matter of eternal weight.
You are actively participating in the architecture of a blessed legacy.
You really are. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. Keep pursuing truth with both your head and your hands.